Hello everyone, I recently took part in the GMTK Jam, where one had 4 days to make a game with the theme of loop. So I started out with a simple first-person controller because my idea was to have the player replay the same few minutes in time, but from the perspective of different members of a family. Beginning, I thought, perhaps with a baby, so I made this simple scribble script which shoots out a ray to find the intersection with a piece of paper, figures out the coordinates of the point relative to that paper, and then fires off a compute shader to just fill in the pixels within some radius around that point. So now we can scribble away, although it gets a bit dotty if you go too fast. Then I just set it up to switch to the scribble view on a button press, and had it change the color based on which crayon you clicked. I began working on this game around 10 PM, and it was now just past midnight, so I decided to call that day 0 and head to bed. The next morning, though, it was time to set up some scribble scoring to give a sense of progress, and I toyed with the idea first of using this little doodle detector I made a while back to make the player try to actually draw something specific. But in the end, I didn't want to cramp the baby style too much, and simply scored the artwork based on having some minimum amount of page coloured in, and using at least a little bit of every colour. Please do pardon the code being absolutely horrendous in this project, by the way. But anyway, this way you can scribble almost anything you want and still complete the goal. This, for instance, as you can probably tell, is the Mona Lisa. Next, I finally gave birth to the baby in Blender, and it's been a really long time since I've had to actually animate anything, so obviously it was a huge relief to see that my skills haven't diminished in the slightest. And here the baby is, waddling around the world. Obviously, the animation is mainly for the benefit of the other characters once we get to those, but I do also think it adds quite a lot for the baby just to be able to see its own shadow as it moves, and its belly bobbling about if you happen to look straight down. Then for the next task, I remembered my nieces having a blast banging away on the xylophone last time I visited, and decided to model one quickly for the game. So here you simply click on the different notes and it plays a little sound effect. I even made a special animation for this, although I forgot to add it to the final game, which is rather sad since I feel I really surpassed myself here. Anyway, I then thought maybe the baby would appreciate something intellectual for its final activity, and for that I turned to the Towers of Hanoi, where, as you probably know, you need to move all the blocks from the start peg to the end, while always placing big blocks below little ones to maintain the structural integrity of the tower. These tasks are looking pretty bland at the moment, but the hope is to have time later to spice them up, since for now I just wanted to quickly get another character involved so I could start figuring out how the sort of time loop stuff would work. So I found a cute little cat on Poly.pizza, which is a site I ended up using quite extensively, so many thanks of course to everyone sharing cool Creative Commons stuff over there. All I added to this cat was a simple rig and animation of the quality you can rely on me for, and here it is imported into the game. So we can run around, and if we look down, we see our little paws pattering away. There is a slight problem though in that if we look up instead, we see the inside of our own head. So my quick fix was to just check if we're looking at all upwards, and set the renderer to shadow only in that case. So now, while we're looking down, everything's normal, but looking up we can see the mesh disappear, to avoid seeing our own eyeballs and so on. After that brief diversion, I then created this little keyframe structure for storing the position and rotation of the player, as well as some animation parameters, and then just recorded that data roughly 30 times per second. For playing this back, I wasn't sure yet of a lot of details, such as whether I'd need fast forward and rewind capabilities, or whether it'd be recording the whole time or not, so I went with what I felt was most flexible, which was to just take the current playback time and then do a binary search. So starting at the middle keyframe, we look if that's too early or too late, in order to halve the amount of frames left to search, and then just repeat that halving process until only 2 frames remain. The current time must then be somewhere between them, and so we just do a linear interpolation of the values stored in those. With that, we can now try running around a bit, and then a press of a button will put our character into playback mode, where we can see it retracing our steps. For whatever reason, I then decided the most pressing matter was adding a main menu to the game, although I didn't get as far as actually making the buttons do anything before getting distracted by something else. But I did also decide on the name Family Time for the game, and repurposed this old character of mine again to play the role of teenager in the family. What I got distracted by was searching for some more models to start building out the little living room slash kitchen play area, before bouncing back to the recording code to store things like the mouse coordinates when scribbling, or the note indices when playing the xylophone, and implementing some simple playback for those as well. At last, I then returned to make the play button work, and also turned the baby green, although I have no recollection of what backstory I was imagining there. Regardless, we can now run around achieving our baby goals, and once done, the scene is reloaded, but with a static counter incremented to tell us that the cat should now be the controllable character. Lacking goals of our own at the moment, we can just follow the baby around and watch or listen to what it's up to. I was pretty happy to have the basic flow of things in place at this point, from menu to character goals screen to playing as that character, and then switching over to the next character once those goals had been completed. Here's what the progress is looking like in git commits if you care to see, and that was the end of day 1. The next morning I decided to inject some chaos into the household by having one of the cat's great ambitions being knocking over candles and causing a bunch of fires. I was a bit concerned though about making these candles physics-based, since I wanted a later task to be actually extinguishing the fires, so if they went in an awkward spot behind the TV or something, that task could possibly become impossible. So I compromised by predefining a few vectors along which a force could be applied, and then when the cat enters the candle's trigger sphere, it just looks at which of those aligns best with the cat's direction and uses that. I also made it then that pressing a key within the editor would allow me to quickly test each of those possibilities to ensure that they were all well behaved. Beyond arson, I thought the cat might enjoy hunting down some flies, so I imported my ancient Bezier tool to define a path for said flies to follow, and also wrote a quick controller script to call the relevant path functions, increase the speed slightly when flying downwards, like a little gravity boost I guess, and also to flap the wings with a sine wave. So we can now run around in an endless loop trying to catch the fly, which is very tricky, or I suppose the better strategy is to lie in wait and just pounce perfectly as it passes by. Not like that, but you get the idea. Now, cats are also notorious nappers, of course, so I made a task for that and added a particle system to spawn some Z-meshes to indicate snoozing. An appropriate animation is obviously still missing, but I really wanted to finalize the full set of playable characters, so I found a model for Mother and just made a few tweaks in Blender before bringing her into the game. She's going to need to get to the fire extinguisher that's sagely been stashed well out of reach of anyone on top of the fridge. I'm thinking there'll be some sort of jumping puzzle to get there, but I have to figure out the level design for that still. Finally, there is Father, and he's going to be there at the end to record the chaos as a little home movie montage, or probably just snap some stills since time is starting to feel quite tight. Like, I actually had one more character in mind, which was going to be the family fish, and there I was intending to use my old Boyd's project to have some other fishy friends frolicking about, and you'd maybe have a little obstacle course to swim through and catch food dropped in by one of the previous characters. But I'd rather create something more polished with a smaller scope than just keep adding every idea I have. So back to Dad, I used this capture screenshot as texture function to grab the screen and display it as a preview for a second or so. I struggled to get this working properly, however. It was upside down and off-center and missing half of the image at one point. So instead I decided to just allocate an array of render textures here, and then have a separate camera for the camera, which can be manually triggered to render into one of those textures when we click. And trying it out, this version just worked right away, so that was nice. I find it surprisingly entertaining actually to just stroll around the little house and photograph things. Maybe I should take up photography in the real world. What do you think? Do I have potential? This here, by the way, is the windscreen I've quickly made for the game. Anyway, hopping back to the Mother for a moment, I made that little jumping puzzle I mentioned, where you have to leap up onto this door that's been left slightly ajar, then onto some jars, and finally make your way up to the fridge via the toaster. You can also now pick up the fire extinguisher and send a bunch of spheres flying from it, which is my fabulous attempt at a foam effect. And of course I set up the same kind of recording stuff for this as well, though this time capturing and replaying input timings rather than the position of every single particle, since that seemed somewhat overkill. I do wish I'd spent some time earlier on to make more of a system for doing this stuff, because I've just been copy-pasting code for every task and tweaking as needed, which is quite annoying. But then again, it's obviously easier in hindsight when I know exactly what the needs of the system are going to be. Still, I was reasonably happy with the progress so far, and once again you can peruse the logs if that's somehow of any interest, but that marks the end of day number 2. Bright and early on the penultimate day, I began with the logical next step of coding a little procedural planet generator. Once that was working, I then imported the aeroplane controller from my old geography game, though the scale needed some slight adjusting, and I thought it could be at least somewhat fun to have to pilot the plane through some hoops as you fly around the world. For these hoops, I made a quick script that runs in the editor, and simply sets the hoop to be at a fixed elevation and orients them correctly on the sphere as well. That way it was a pretty painless process to quickly set up a little course through the mountains. And here's what the gameplay is looking like now. I had been dreaming of something more elaborate with enemies to dodge and clouds to fly through, but there's really no time for that. So this planet hangs out in the backyard of the house over here, and now as the teenager you need to go over and grab a controller, and then wander over to the television to zoom through some hoops. Much like the dad's camera of course, the plane game is just being drawn to its own render texture, which is then applied to the TV screen. And if we jump back in time to a different character, we can see those inputs have been recorded and are being played back here as well. This little minigame is totally isolated, so it doesn't much matter here, but it was a bit of a trade-off in general deciding whether to record player inputs or actually store the positions and rotations of stuff every frame. Like, consider the cat here for instance, jumping up onto each person's head to maybe reach some tall cupboard or something. If we then look back at this later, after the other characters have been played, we'll see the cat simply leaping off of empty air if the positions are being played back, whereas if inputs are played back instead, the cat would immediately fall to the floor of course, so the physics would make sense, but the rest of its inputs would then be completely nonsensical, and it would look like the cat had totally lost the plot. I'd actually forgotten until thinking about this that my last Game Jam entry almost 7 years ago it seems, which I'm struggling to believe, but regardless, that little game did use this concept of playing back inputs and having to sort of plan interactions between your past and future selves in order to solve some simple puzzles. I did want to keep the puzzle aspect extremely light this time around though, so I decided to just allow those sorts of wonky air-jumping situations to arise. Anyway, I worked a while then on making the menu scene slightly snazzier, since that's the first thing one sees of course, and also made the camera zoom into your current character and display their goals and controls. I also wanted to flesh out each of these goals a bit, so I added more flies to catch, more candles to topple, and a bunch more potential snoozing spots to choose from. I also finally added this sleeping animation for the cat, and I was extremely tempted to make a unique pose for every location, but time was sadly not on my side for such extravagances. I'll have to save that for the DLC. Instead, I added a pause menu and a very crude settings menu, and then tried to make the baby's tasks a bit more visually interesting at least. For instance, adding a subtle wobble to the camera when you move the mouse, which I also used in the main menu, just so it doesn't feel so frozen, and then a few lines of code as well to make the discs fly in an arc through the air, rather than teleporting instantly. And here we can see those changes in action. Obviously, I won't claim this is suddenly the most exciting game in the world, but it does help just bring it to life a bit, I'd say. So same story then with the xylophone, repurposing the little arc animation for the stick so that there's something going on there as well, although one slight problem was the stick sticking through the notes if you clicked too high up. But rather than spending too much time getting fancy with the animation, I just went with a quick fix of defining a line segment along the lower region where the existing animation worked fine, and then in the code just find the closest point on that line segment from where you click. So now we can click wherever and it still looks fine. I then moved on to the scribbling task where I replaced the boxes with actual crayon models, and made the model follow your mouse around when you pick it up, and press down against the page when you click. I also fixed the spottiness we saw earlier when scribbling too swiftly, simply by dispatching the shader multiple times between the previous and current draw coordinates. So now we can scribble with as much enthusiasm as we want, and it still forms a continuous line. Next, I wanted to add one more goal for the teenager, which was to score a goal. And in case you kick the ball under the table or something like that, I added the ability to restart the level, but also a second ball over here as a backup that you can score with instead. I did have some more ideas for the teenager, like maybe he could have had a vacuuming chore, for which I could have borrowed a lot of the code from my old Super Choreman experiment, and I wanted to give him some sort of homework assignment to complete as well, but I was getting sleepy, so I decided to call it a night instead. Here's once again an overview of the day in git commits, and that was end of day 3. The fourth and final day began by hunting down sound effects on opengameart.org, which has quite a vast collection. This is such a tiny game, but it still felt like the list of things wanting sounds would never end. Grabbing a snack, pooping a ball, starting a fire, or taking a nap, it just went on. And each of these needed their volumes to be adjusted, or often their start times to be trimmed to not sound too delayed, as well as a line of code to actually trigger them, so it really ate up a lot of time. Another bit of very simple sound design I did was in the tower puzzle, tying the pitch of the sound effect to the size of the disc you're moving. So we get a higher pitch whoosh for the little ones and a more rumbly whoosh for the bigger blocks, just to make it a bit less repetitive. Even so, I did get rid of one of the discs, as you can see, just to make it more baby-friendly and a bit less boring to play. I then also wanted to balance the other tasks, like making the hitboxes on the flies a bit more forgiving, and especially the mother's route to the fridge I realized might be unreasonably convoluted. So I experimented first with making some objects pushable, meaning you could get a chair over to the counter and clamber up like that, but it felt a bit too easy then, and so instead I just added a new, shorter alternative via this lamp. In the feedback I got after the jam though, a number of people did still mention getting stuck at this point, and I guess it is a rather unintuitive thing to do. Some found other solutions though, such as bouncing off their baby's head while playing the xylophone, or even just timing the perfect leap off the table, which was supposed to be impossible. It was also mentioned that perhaps the more agile cat could have had the option of being just slightly repentant and pushing the extinguisher down. But anyway, I then thought it would be fun for each character to have their own theme song, so I hunted a while on OpenArt again, grabbing something jaunty for the mischievous cat to jam to, a soothing lullaby of sorts for the baby, and something more rock and roll for the teenager. Then for the mother, I first thought something frantic since she's fighting all those fires, but in the end pictured her putting on some tranquil tunes to keep calm to instead. I actually thought it would be funny to have a radio in the kitchen where the family members would be fighting over which channel to listen to, but never got round to that. Lastly though, I still needed a song for Dad, for whom I pictured something slightly goofy and carefree as he roams around snapping shots of the family, or the flies, or the furniture. Around this time, I also had the idea of adding a post-processing effect when playing as the cat that would reduce the amount of red in the scene, since I believe they don't perceive that very well. But it just kinda looked like the living room was underwater. So I then looked up some maths for converting from RGB to LMS, standing for the long, medium, and short wavelength cones in human vision, and I tried scaling down the contribution of the long wavelengths and then converting that back to RGB. This made things very green though. Finally then, after 5 or so minutes of failing to fix this, I found some code on ShaderToy emulating red-green color blindness, which I hoped would be close enough to a cat. But I started to worry that it might come across as a rendering bug without maybe some depth of field or whatever to really sell the effect. So I gave up on the shader since the deadline was starting to loom large and I wanted to upload early in case the servers went down under a flurry of last-minute activity. So I made some builds and played through the game on Windows and Linux to make sure it worked, all the while taking some truly incomprehensible notes for final tweaks such as wonky fade sleep and maybe Dad via TV. After addressing those concerns, whatever they might have meant, I uploaded the game with about an hour and a half left on the clock. There was still one annoying issue I hoped to fix before the time ran out though, which was that every now and again at random times as far as I could tell, the screen would flash black for a single frame. I noticed that this usually occurred at least once within the first 30 frames of startup, and tried stepping through the game frame by frame to catch it and analyze the issue, but frustratingly, doing this seemed to prevent the problem from occurring. So I devised a cunning plan to simply pause the editor from a script instead once it reached the 15th frame and just keep rerunning it until the black screen occurred exactly at that moment. And would you believe it, it almost worked. Here we can see the editor is paused and the screen is black, but unfortunately it only persisted for a few milliseconds before magically resolving itself despite being paused. So that didn't really buy me enough time for any intensive debugging. Eventually though, by trial and error, I noticed that the flicker no longer occurred in deferred, which then led me to discover that it was the multi-sample anti-aliasing in particular that was causing the issue, although I have no idea why. Still, it was at least something that I could work around, but when I went to check the submission timer and saw there was only -1 minute left, I realized I'd been too slow. And so, the first version I uploaded would have to be the final version, because the jam was officially over. Even though I was very sleepy by this point, I was even more so excited to see what others had been up to, and spent an enjoyable rest of the evening playing a random assortment of entries. It's kind of funny to think that just all of a sudden there's almost 10,000 new games out in the world, representing so much work and creativity and learning concentrated into this tiny amount of time. Anyway, let me ramble some closing thoughts over a family time playthrough. First of all, I did have a lot of fun, and it was cool to take part in something like this again. I've never been the best at handling time pressure, and so I'd also find these quite stressful and often struggle to fall asleep since I'm constantly trying to plan what I still want to do and whether there's enough time left to do it in. It feels silly to fret over something so low stakes, but brains are notoriously hard to reason with. Then, reflecting a bit on the game itself, I think it's quite fun to play, even if only for a few minutes, so I'm happy about that. There were many things I would have liked to have added but didn't have time for, but that's par for the course in a jam, of course. I think most of all I'd have liked to have more interactions between the different characters. At the moment there's really just the cat knocking over the candles for the mother to later extinguish, and of course the dad taking photos, but otherwise they were very isolated. So I wish I'd been a bit more creative in that regard when coming up with the various minigames. The main thing I was disappointed with though was just that a number of people experienced crashes while playing, and some were even unable to complete the first stage because of it. I haven't been able to reproduce that yet, but I would like to figure out what went wrong there at some point. Graphically, I think I could have done a better job even without spending too much more time on it, just in terms of color choice and filling out empty spaces, and maybe a bit of post-processing as well could have gone a long way. The audio side of things I was more happy with, although of course like the graphics I relied almost entirely on pre-made assets, which is perfectly fine, but I do find it more fun and interesting when things are custom made during the jam, even if the quality is way worse and the scope has to be smaller as a result. So that's maybe something to aim for next time. Anyway, in case you're curious how the game fared in the ratings, here are the numbers. At the top, almost 4.5 out of 5 for enjoyment and creativity, which I'm thrilled to see, although I realize there's a possibility of bias from some people knowing my videos and maybe unconsciously just giving it a little boost because of that. So let me know if you think it's more interesting or better etiquette perhaps to take part anonymously. Either way, the next category was narrative, which I found a bit tricky when rating games myself, since quite often there was no story at all, which is the case in this game as well. So I was surprised to do as well as 4 out of 5, but I'm glad that people felt some notion of narrative, or at least of the different character personalities in this little household. Then finally, audio and artwork scored 3.6 apiece. Alright, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game and what I could have done better, and if you took part yourself, I'd also be interested in hearing about your own experience in the jam. Okay, I need to stop rambling at some point, so I'll just end by saying well done to everyone who managed to make something, and a big thank you of course to GMTK himself and anyone else behind the scenes making the whole thing run. It was a lot of fun. By the way, I've now uploaded a post-jam version with some tiny fixes, such as this little bug I came across where restarting a level a bunch of times would fail to clear the playback data, and so all the forces from every attempt would be applied to the candles, for instance, sending them hurtling across the living room. And I also fixed that flickering issue just by switching to a different type of anti-aliasing. Alright, thanks for watching, and until next time, cheers.